Welcome. It is so lovely to be back in action with another season of the Insightful Leader Live. I'm Jess Love, Editor-in-Chief of Kellogg Insight. I want to briefly mention next month's webinar. We're going to hear from Professor Aaron Yoon on the future of ESG investing. That's investing that takes into account the environmental, social, and governmental activities of a firm. And ESG investing is at a crossroads right now. During a bull market, most portfolios will make money, so it's a lot easier to marry financial goals with social ones. During a bear market, the pressure for financial returns is amped up a lot. So Professor Yoon will take us through where ESG investing might be headed next. It should be really interesting. That's going to be on November 17th at noon. That's a Thursday. Today, of course, we are going to hear from Professor David Besanko about a very important and very complicated new piece of legislation, one that I personally have been watching with bated breath for a very long time now. But first, some housekeeping. We're going to close the chat box soon, so please leave your questions in the Q&A box. We'll do a Q&A at the end. You can also upvote each other's questions. In fact, we recommend it. Closed captioning is available. You can access it via live transcript at the bottom of the screen. This event will be recorded and you will get emailed a link to a video of this presentation probably early next week. All right, let's go to the main event. David Besanko is the IBM Professor of Regulation and Competitive Practice here at Kellogg. He's an expert in the economics of public policy and has published over 50 articles in leading economics and business journals. And he has received numerous awards for his teaching, so we are all in for a treat today. Professor Bisenko, let me turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Jess. I am going to be talking about a piece of legislation known as the Inflation Reduction Act. So I want to start with a poll, and the poll has 5 choices. The Inflation Reduction Act is a healthcare bill, a tax reform bill, and a climate policy bill, and a deficit reduction bill. Will have negligible effects on the deficit, will have very small effects on global warming and temperature rise, is a big effing deal, excellent public policy that does more good than harm, or number 5, requires permitting reform. So choose one of those 5. And we will close the poll in another 15 seconds. So which of these 5 characterizes the new climate bill, formerly known as the Inflation Reduction Act? Let's close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let's close that poll and let's have a look at the results. Looks like we have 44% of you saying that it is a healthcare bill, etc. 22% saying it will have a negligible effect on inflation. 10% saying that it will have a small effect on global greenhouse gas emissions. 15% saying it's a big effing deal. And 9% saying it requires permitting reform. Well, what's the correct answer? Well, this is a trick question because I'm going to argue, I hope persuasively, that the correct answer is any one of these 5, all of these 5, all of the above. And so I'm going to see if I can persuade you of that through the course of the next few minutes. So here's my outline. I want to talk, first of all, just to give you an overview of the Inflation Reduction Act. Then I want to address whether the Inflation Reduction Act actually makes a difference either to the budget deficit or to inflation, or to global temperature rise. Then I'm going to argue that the climate provisions of the IRA really are a big effing deal for 3 reasons. First of all, because the legislation has some important innovative policy provisions as they relate to climate. Secondly, because the bill creates incentives, I think significant ones, and significant opportunities for the US to build a robust climate economy. And third, I'm going to try to persuade you that the social benefits of this legislation exceed its social costs by a lot. And then I'm going to talk about a key next step, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. All right, so let me start with just an overview. First of all, a little bit of an overview of the history of this act. So back in the 2020 presidential campaign, candidate Joe Biden put forward, after he had actually consolidated support to basically clinch the nomination, put forward something called the Build Back Better plan, which was aimed at enabling the United States to rebuild after the pandemic. This was a plan for a whole bunch of things: infrastructure investment, new social programs, environmental protection, and so on, that would rival the Great Society and the New Deal in its scope. And then in the spring of 2021, the Biden administration actually brings this into fruition by introducing something called the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. What then happened was that the physical infrastructure provisions of the American Jobs Plan were split off, and that eventually became the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was a bipartisan supported infrastructure bill passed last November. And then in September of 2021, the climate provisions of the American Jobs Plan plus the social provisions of the American Families Plan were all combined into something called the Build Back Better Act, which was to be passed through a legislative procedure in the United States known as reconciliation. So then resulting from that was a whole bunch of negotiations involving a bunch of different parts of the Democratic legislative coalition. And it got scaled down, but a version of this was passed by the House in November of 2021. More negotiations took place, particularly with Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. But in December of 2021, he publicly says he is not going to support this bill. It looks like the Build Back Better Act at that point is dead. But unbeknownst to us, there was still negotiation going on between Manchin and Senate Democrats. And in July of 2022, it was announced publicly that there was a new version of the Build Back Better Act, relabeled the Inflation Reduction Act. This passes the Senate by a one-vote majority, with the vice president breaking the tie. It passes the House, interestingly, by pretty much the same vote that the Build Back Better Act passed the House in November of 2021. And this was then signed into law back in August by President Biden. So what does it have in it? Well, basically, the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, has three big parts to it. The first pertains to healthcare, the second pertains to taxation, and the third pertains to climate policy. So I'm going to mainly talk about the climate policy provisions of this law, but let me just give you an overview to show you all the different parts of it. So the healthcare provisions actually mainly pertain to Medicare, and they enable Medicare to now negotiate the prices of certain high expenditure drugs starting in 2024, I believe. It also puts price caps on high expenditure Medicare drugs. Has this other technical feature where it delays a Trump administration drug rebate rule. And then finally, it extends the enhanced Affordable Care Act marketplace subsidies for those who purchase private health insurance through the Obamacare exchanges. The tax provisions actually have three main pieces. The first is a new alternative minimum corporate tax, which basically is a 15% tax, alternative tax aimed at companies that use approaches like accelerated depreciation to reduce their tax bill, their income tax bill down to zero. So that goes into effect. There's a new excise tax on stock buybacks. Together, those two provisions are expected to raise almost $300 billion over 10 years. And then there's money that goes to IRS enforcement, which involves an expenditure of about $80 billion, but which is estimated by the Congressional Budget Office to result in a recouping of tax revenue on the order of $180 billion over 10 years. So those are the two pieces I'm not going to talk about, although I'm glad to talk about or answer any questions that you might have about them during the chat, during the Q&A. I mainly want to talk about the climate provisions, which fall into two broad buckets. The first are a whole set, a big portfolio of clean energy tax credits. And then there's a set of climate related public investments. And just to give you a flavor of these, I know it's pretty hard to read the slides. And by the way, I should say that we're going to make a set of these slides available to participants at some point after the talk is over. So you can see that there's a whole bunch of tax credits that basically total, and this is my estimate, this is based on the CBO scoring, but it's my own estimate, not the estimate that you see in the papers, the newspapers. I'm estimating that this is going to create additional spending through the tax code, basically revenue not collected, on the order of $235 billion, $236 billion over 10 years. And then there are additional public investments on the order of $84 billion. So will it make a difference? Will it have an impact? Well, one way we can look at that is to look at the Congressional Budget Office's estimates of the budgetary implications. So that's what this chart shows. It shows that the red line shows the, let me start with the blue line. The blue line shows the changes in direct government outlays, federal government outlays. You can actually see that that blue line falls below zero, and that's because at some point around 2027, and that's because the Medicare provisions will actually result in lower spending on Medicare, it's estimated, because the federal government won't be reimbursing as much for prescription drugs to the extent that Medicare is able to negotiate good deals. Then there's the green line, which is the change in revenue relative to the baseline, the budgetary baseline. I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. And then the red line is the change in revenue due to greater IRS enforcement. There'll be more revenue collected as a result of that. So what do these numbers mean? That's kind of hard to tell from this graph. So just to kind of summarize, first of all, over 10 years, we're talking about changes in direct spending on the order of an additional $51 billion of direct spending, an additional $109 billion from the alternative minimum tax and the excise tax on share repurchases. That's $109 billion. And then the change from IRS enforcement aggregated over 10 years is $180 billion. The net effect of this over 10 years is to reduce the US budget deficit by over this 10-year window from 2022 to 2031 by roughly $240 billion. And by the way, if you're wondering, well, like what about beyond 2031? Well, we don't know because the Congressional Budget Office is required only to score the legislation over a 10-year window. And because the legislation was passed under this parliamentary procedure known as budget reconciliation, basically all of the provisions of this law end at the end of that 10-year window, if not before. So this legislation is really not going to, at least from a statutory point of view, is not going to be permanent. Now, putting this in context, this is a chart that shows US federal government projected outlays and revenues, again, projections from the Congressional Budget Office. What's called the baseline here is what the Congressional Budget Office is projecting if we don't have the Inflation Reduction Act. So you can see in 2021, we're talking about outlays of about $6.8 trillion, revenues of a little over $4 trillion, resulting in a budget deficit for fiscal year 2021, which ended last September, of about $2.7 trillion. The budget deficit for the fiscal year that just ended, 2022, is going to be about $1 trillion. And you can see the CBO is projecting that budget deficits in the United States will be about $1 trillion and actually growing over time to something more like $2 trillion over the next 10 years. What impact does the Inflation Reduction Act actually have on all of this? Well, a pretty small one, actually. Even though the bill itself is big, the percentage change in outlays over a 10-year period is less than 1%, is less than 0.1%. The percentage change in revenues is about 0.5%, and the reduction in the budget deficit is about 1.38%. So these are, they're not trivial, they're not meaningless, but they're not very large given the scale of the entire US federal budget. And for this reason, perhaps it's not surprising that for forecasters like the Penn-Wharton budget model that do forecasting of budgetary implications for the US economy of changes to the US federal budget, they're not forecasting really that this will have much of an impact either on inflation. They say the act would have no meaningful effect on inflation in the near term. It will reduce inflation by around 0.1 percentage points, I should say, by the middle of the first decade. And it will have virtually no effect on real GDP, at least using the models that forecasters like the Penn-Wharton budget model actually use. So not much probably of a difference is this going to make in terms of the macroeconomic trajectory of the US economy, either in the near term or the longer term. How much difference will this make for reducing global warming? Well, the tool that I'm going to show you is something called the C-ROADS Climate Simulator. This is actually a very nice tool. We have a link to this in the PowerPoint slides, and I think on the in the chat eventually, that allows you to go online and actually simulate different kinds of climate policy initiatives. And consistent with projections by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their 5th assessment, this projection calls for, in its baseline, a rise in emissions around the world, resulting in, by the end of the 21st century, a 3.6 degrees centigrade increase in global temperatures relative to the standard industrial revolution baseline, relative to the level of temperatures that prevailed back in the 1870s. Right now, if you're interested, right now, we're kind of at about 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, somewhere in that vicinity. So what impact will the Inflation Reduction Act actually have on this trajectory? Well, the answer is not a lot. If you assume a 2.5% decrease in annual emissions due to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is roughly consistent with the Princeton University Zero Project forecast, this will reduce US emissions. You can see that red line goes down. The US emissions trajectory is that red line in this chart. So that goes down, but there's still a lot of other emissions coming from all over the world: China, Europe, India, and the rest of the world, that darker blue line. And the Inflation Reduction Act is arguably not going to have much of an impact on any of those, although we could perhaps talk about maybe knock-on effects later on. So the Inflation Reduction Act by itself reduces warming by about 1/10 of a degree centigrade. By the way, if you're interested in what 3.6 degrees centigrade actually, that level of warming actually means, that translates into like 0.8 meters of sea level rise, which is pretty significant. I mean, that's enough to kind of pretty much put Miami Beach underwater. That's enough to put some significant portions of that area kind of in that, the body of water between Manhattan and the Hudson River and New Jersey, some portions of that underwater. This would result in a 9.2% increase in additional deaths from extreme heat annually. It would put about 380 million people at risk for extreme flooding. So this is a pretty serious projection. The Inflation Reduction Act will help, but it's not going to make a big dent in this. That's going to require much more, in particular, much more in terms of global cooperation. All right, so if that's the case, if this is not going to reduce the budget deficit all that much, if it's not going to reduce inflation all that much, if it's not going to increase GDP all that much, if it's not going to reduce global warming all that much, like what good is it? Like, why am I about to argue that this is still a BFD, By the way, where that phrase comes from is that's the characterization you may remember by then Vice President Biden at the signing ceremony for the Affordable Care Act back in April of 2010. He said it was a big FD. Why are these climate provisions a BFD? Well, I'm going to argue that they're a BFD for three reasons. First of all, there are some very important innovative policy provisions in this law that we really haven't used at the federal level before. The second is that this law, I would argue, creates some significant incentives and opportunities for the US to build a robust climate economy, maybe in particular because of some of the synergistic effects that haven't been modeled, at least yet as of now. I shouldn't say haven't been modeled, but there have been perhaps underappreciated. And then thirdly, I'm going to argue that the social benefits of the provisions of the climate provisions in this law exceed the social costs by a lot. So let me start with the important policy provisions. The first one, I'm going to give you three examples actually. The first example are technology neutral clean energy tax credits. And I'm going to illustrate this, I'm going to use the example of the production tax credit. So traditionally, energy policy in the United States has been carried out using tax credits. But all of these tax credits are tied to particular technologies or particular applications. So an example is the production tax credit. So the production tax credit gives a credit off of corporate income taxes for renewable electricity facilities that generate electricity using wind or solar or a variety of other sources. But they have to use these technologies. So this credit actually expired at the end of 2021. The IRA actually extends this traditional production tax credit, PTC, for projects that are started before the end of 2024. But for projects that begin in 2025 or afterwards, the PTC, along with its first cousin, the investment tax credit, which gives a tax credit for investments as opposed to production of kilowatt hours, for new plants that are begun after 2025, the IRA creates a technology neutral production tax credit and a technology neutral investment tax credit. And this would mean that power plants would qualify for a production tax credit irrespective of the technology that they use, provided that their greenhouse gas emissions are 0 or less. Now, why is this important? Well, this is important for, I would argue, for two reasons. First of all, it essentially extends the PTC to a variety of other technologies, including electricity storage facilities. It also has, if you think about it, incentives that replicate those of a carbon tax. So with a carbon tax, you actually pay if you have positive carbon emissions. If you're a power plant and you're subject to a carbon tax, you actually pay based on the carbon reduction, the carbon that you emit, not the carbon reduction, but the carbon you save based on carbon reduction, you pay based on the carbon content that you emit. Emissions-based subsidies, you're basically paying by foregoing the subsidy if you have positive carbon emissions. And so what this does is that it creates incentives for fossil-based electricity producers to find ways to eliminate emissions, such as retrofitting natural gas plants with carbon removal technologies, or building new natural gas plants that have direct air capture associated with them. So this is, I think, a more powerful incentive than the PTC, which was itself a powerful incentive. This makes it even more powerful. A second example of innovative policy is the methane emissions fee. So this is a fee on methane emissions, mainly coming from natural gas exploration and production and transportation facilities. All of the red stuff in this picture on the right-hand side of the slide, all of these facilities are subject to this methane emissions charge. That's about 2,200 facilities, accounting for about 78 million metric tons of carbon emissions equivalent. So this fee begins at $900 per metric ton in 2024. It increases to $1,200 per ton in 2025 and goes to 1,000. That should be actually should be I think $1,500 per ton of methane thereafter. So this is a really big deal. I think this has kind of been understated in terms of how I believe how important this is. This is the very first time that the United States has imposed a fee on emissions of a greenhouse gas. And this is a particularly potent greenhouse gas because it has 25 times the global warming potential of 1 ton of CO2. And the third reason I think this is a big deal is that the level of the fee is actually very sensible. So $900 per metric ton of methane is equivalent to a fee of $36 per ton of CO2. So this rises eventually to a fee of $60 per ton of CO2. And this is actually consistent with at least the lower bound estimates of the social cost of carbon. So, you know, I'm not sure you remember from your economics classes something called a Pigouvian tax. You know, if you took my class, you may remember it. But this would make the methane emissions fee actually a very good Pigouvian tax for methane. So I think it's very important, and it gives, if the United States eventually did go in the direction of pricing carbon, this is a platform to build on. So a third example of innovative policy is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So this is the first federal level green financing model. It's a kind of a national version of state level or local level green banks, such as the Connecticut Green Bank or the Montgomery County Green Bank. It provides $27 billion of competitive grants to state, local, and tribal governments and nonprofit institutions, basically in 3 tranches, 15 billion, 2 tranches of which totaling $15 billion are directed at low income or disadvantaged communities. So basically the recipients of these grants are nonprofit organizations that provide capital for green projects. It also can be used by state and local governments to set up their own green banks. So this is a big deal, not only because it provides additional capital for projects that are socially valuable potentially, but which could not on their own attract sufficient private capital to be viable, but this is also the funds provided by this policy actually can act synergistically with the tax credits. And so to the extent that the tax credits make it attractive to adopt a zero emissions technology or low emissions renewable technologies, this actually can provide the financing needed to actually get those projects off the ground. So this is, I think, an important policy innovation as well. So will the IRA help the US build a robust climate economy? I'm going to argue that I think it will. And let me suggest why having a robust climate economy is important. First of all, it allows the United States better control over its own fate in global energy markets. It buffers the US better from oil price shocks, certainly relevant in light of the news today, yesterday or day before yesterday, about the actions of OPEC+. Secondly, it increases US credibility in climate diplomacy. It enables the United States to better position itself as a leader in working to reduce global warming. And then thirdly, relatedly, but I think it's worth emphasizing distinctly, this gives the United States, having a robust climate-based economy, gives the United States the ability to affect emissions reduction outside the United States through technology transfer. That dark blue line is, remember, that's like the most important reason right now why the world is on track to a 3.5 degree centigrade increase in temperature. There's lots of emissions coming from lots of different parts of the world, many of which are countries that are still emerging markets. And so the United States, if it has a lot of different kind of climate activities and climate sectors and industries, kind of innovating and perfecting and producing, that gives the United States the ability to transfer this technology to help other countries reduce their emissions. Now, why does this work to make the United States a robust climate economy? Well, I think there are three reasons. First of all, these clean energy tax credits are open-ended. There's no limit. There's no limit on how much these tax credits can potentially support clean energy projects. So to be concrete, my analysis of the CBO scoring of the IRA suggested that these tax credits, the spending through the tax code, would be on the order of $236 billion over 10 years. But the amount could be higher than this because there's no budget limit on these tax credits. And if renewable energy investments and production is actually higher than that the CBO forecasts, the spending could be even higher than this. And so relevant to this, there was a Credit Suisse analysis that's gotten some attention recently in this article in The Atlantic that suggests that the total tax credits earned could actually be twice what the CBO was estimating. And they're arguing basically that there are these different pieces of the IRA that are acting synergistically. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund acts synergistically with the various tax credits to actually stimulate production, green production, and green investments to an even greater extent than many currently believe will happen. Secondly, there's just a whole bunch of new sources of clean energy funding and a whole bunch of new tax credits in this law. Here's a picture that just shows the new or substantially expanded clean energy tax credits. There's a nuclear production tax credit. There's a used electric vehicle tax credit. It used to be that you could only get a tax credit for EVs if they were new. There's a really beefed up alternative fuel refueling property tax credit, which can be used for electric vehicle charging stations by, let's say, apartment complexes. There's an advanced manufacturing tax credit for clean energy components like photovoltaic cells. There's a direct air capture tax credit. So there's a whole bunch of, and there's actually a qualified commercial clean vehicle tax credit, which didn't exist before. So there's a whole bunch of these new tax credits. And then there's all of these various new or expanded public investment programs like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund or the Advanced Industrial Facilities Deployment Program, which gives grants to steel makers or cement makers to help them make it easier for them to invest in, let's say, direct air capture or other things that mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's the Department of Energy Loan Program, which was, I think, created in the initial Obama era stimulus in 2009, which has now been kind of beefed up with an additional $4.3 billion of additional funding and about $40 billion of authorization to give in loan guarantees. So these are all like either new or significantly bigger than they used to be. And then thirdly, the IRA contains some really novel domestic sourcing provisions. And to illustrate this, let me give you the example of the plug-in electric vehicle tax credit. So the electric vehicle tax credit existed. Again, I think that was created in the Obama era stimulus. The IRA extends this, making it worth up to $7,500 for income qualifying individuals. But here's the thing, to qualify for the tax credit, the final assembly of the vehicle has to take place in North America. To qualify for half of the tax credit, a certain percentage of the battery components must be manufactured and assembled in the US, rising all the way to 100% by 2029. To qualify for the other half of the credit, a certain percentage of minerals used in the batteries must be processed either in North America or in free trade agreement countries, rising to 80% by 2027. And none of these minerals can be obtained by through production in Russia or China or North Korea or several other what are called entities of foreign concern. And this is a pretty novel provision, actually, because the United States does have a long tradition of domestic content regulations for federal government procurement and for federal transportation and water funding grants to states, requiring, let's say, that the cement on a road be actually procured from a U.S. cement supplier. But this is the first time, as far as I know, that you had domestic sourcing regulations that are part of a tax credit program. So you have domestic sourcing regulations for the EV tax credit. And then actually there's also domestic sourcing regulations for the production tax credit as well, and the investment tax credit for renewable facilities and renewable energy production. So will this make a difference? Well, let me show you the Princeton University Zero Lab forecast of the impact of the IRA on private investment and in energy supply infrastructure. So here's the baseline with no IRA. And you can see that they're forecasting on the order of about $200 billion in 2022 of investment per year out to 2035. There's a lot of wind and solar in there, but it's kind of constant, no like big changes in composition or level. This is their forecast, and they have actually a very sophisticated and I think compelling model to do these forecasts of what happens to annual capital investment with the IRA. You can see increases in both scale of investment all the way up to $900 billion by 2035 in total capital investment in energy supply infrastructure in the US. Much of it is wind and solar, but some of it is hydrogen, that bright red box at the top. Some of it is nuclear. Actually, nuclear you can't really see. It's actually not very much. They're not forecasting much nuclear. Some of it is actually the magenta is fossil fuel powered energy supply with carbon capture. So this makes a difference. The IRA does. Here is the Zero Lab model forecast for the impact on the use of carbon capture in the United States. You can see without the IRA, not much in terms of carbon capture. This is now tons of CO2, millions of tons of CO2 captured for either transport or for storage. Kind of flat. This is the forecast for carbon capture with the IRA. And you can see that a lot of this is fossil power electricity generation now using carbon capture, gas power as well as coal power, and actually a pretty big chunk of industrial applications using carbon capture as a result of the tax credits and the support in terms of advanced manufacturing that this legislation provides. Here's employment. This is projected changes in employment by sector due to the IRA. Now, there is going to be some loss of employment in oil and coal, but there's going to be an increase much more than the loss of employment, increases in employment in solar and wind, both on the grid and in manufacturing. So this will translate into, by 2030, 2.3 million additional jobs. So I think there's pretty compelling evidence that the IRA will have the impact of helping move the United States to a much more robust climate-based economy. Let me talk about now benefits versus costs. And I want to start by showing you the impact of the IRA on carbon emissions. I said earlier that it has, like on a global scale, it has a pretty small impact, but at the level of the United States, it has an impact of about a 42% reduction by 2030. Now, you may recall that the Biden administration has set a target of reducing carbon emissions in the US by 50% by 2030. This will get the United States not to that goal quite, but to a little bit more than 80% of that goal. Now, it's an interesting question. How do you get the additional 8%? That's probably going to take place through things like stricter fuel economy standards on automobiles, probably coming down the road, stricter standards for power plants, something like what the Obama administration had tried to propose back in the mid-2010s. But this gets the United States a long way toward that goal. What does that mean exactly? Well, first of all, what does it mean in terms of sectors? This graph actually shows where US greenhouse gas emissions come from. You can see that most come from either transportation, electric power, or industry. Non-trivial amount comes from agriculture, a non-trivial amount comes from commercial and residential buildings. This is where the Inflation Reduction Act is reducing things. So electric power emissions are being reduced. About 37% of those emissions reductions are coming from electric power emissions reductions. This is coming mainly from increases in wind and solar capacity, but to some extent also coming from carbon capture and natural gas, and to some extent coal plants. The transportation reductions are driven primarily by EV adoption, which itself is driven by the continuation of the new EV tax credits, but also due to declining costs of batteries and fuel cells, as well as the declining cost of charging stations. And the industry reductions, representing about 13% of the reductions overall from the IRA, are mainly coming from carbon capture. So just to show you these reductions on a year-by-year basis, okay, that's just mimicking the other slide. But let me translate this into a social value, because carbon emissions come at a cost. They contribute to climate change, which itself is costly for a whole bunch of reasons. And economists have spent years coming up with estimates of what's called the social cost of carbon. And if you use interesting estimates of the social cost of carbon, we can actually put a value on these emissions reductions. So the Biden administration, for its own regulatory policy making, uses a figure of $51 per ton of carbon emissions as the social cost of carbon, which would then be the benefit of reducing carbon emissions. This is almost the same value that the Obama administration began to use in the mid-2010s. It's outdated, actually. It's probably too low. This number is higher. There was a recent study by scholars at Resources for the Future and at University of California, Berkeley, that have suggested that the social cost of carbon might right now be on the order of $185 per ton. In which case, if you do a present value calculation, the social benefit in 2035 of the reductions that are being forecast due to the IRA would be on the order of about $179 billion. So that's one way in which the IRA creates social benefits. Now, the IRA also, by inducing a reduction in carbon emissions, will also induce a reduction in air pollutants that tend to go along with carbon emissions, things like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. And one particularly noxious form of air pollution that comes from both internal combustion engine vehicles, industrial processes, and electricity power generation is particulate matter, PM 2.5 in particular, fine particulate matter that gets in our lungs and compromises our health. This is particulate matter that is so fine that it can penetrate sheetrock in a house and actually find its way inside. So this is pretty bad stuff. And we have estimates of the mortality that's caused by PM 2.5, as well as reductions in mortality that can result from reduced carbon emissions and reduced activity in internal combustion engine vehicles and power plants. And so here's an estimate of the reduction in premature deaths from Zero Lab as a result of PM 2.5 resulting from the IRA. By 2035, we're talking about saving 9,600 premature deaths, saving that many lives from dying prematurely. Let's translate this into dollars. Now, this is, not sure how comfortable you are with putting dollar value on saving lives, but economists do this all the time, and they use something called the value of a statistical life. So Zero Lab actually, in their own analysis, used a value of statistical life of $5 million per premature death avoided. The EPA uses a value of a statistical life of something closer to $11 million. If we apply those two figures to these reductions in mortality due to reduced PM 2.5 emissions, we're coming up with total social benefits on the order, in present value terms in 2022, on the order of somewhere between $238 billion and $512 billion. So let's translate all of this into kind of a little back of the envelope benefit cost analysis. We have the social benefit from reduced carbon emissions on the order of $500 billion to $1,500 or $1.5 trillion. This is in 2022 dollars. The social benefit from reduced mortality, somewhere on the order of $240 billion to $500 billion. What's the social cost? Well, basically, it's the cost to the taxpayers of having to support these programs. We don't collect as much tax revenue. That we've said, or we spend more than we otherwise would, and we've said that that's on the order, in present value terms now, of $275 billion. So if you net that out, that's a big difference. I mean, that's a positive $465 billion. Now, of course, we're missing some things in this little back of the envelope analysis. There's potentially an increase in consumer welfare due to lower prices. Zero Lab is actually predicting lower prices for automobiles, lower prices for electricity because of the tax credits. Of course, there's also increase in business profitability from the winners from this, like firms who are in the clean energy sectors. Of course, that has to be offset by decreases in business profitability of the losers. You might have your own point of view about whether the gains to the winners offset the losses to the losers. My sense is the gains to the winners are probably bigger than the losses to the losers. And then there's other benefits to the US from expansion of a clean energy economy, like reduced exposure to global oil shocks. And there's other public health benefits of reduced air pollution that this analysis that I've shown you does not take into account, like reduced incidence of asthma. So my conclusion is social benefits way bigger than the social costs, which is, in my view, what you should want from your public policymakers. Now, there's a key next step, though, and that is that's because the IRA does not change two fundamental aspects of renewable-based electricity generation. The first is that it's intermittent. You can't dispatch it on demand because you only get wind when wind is blowing. You only get solar when there is sun. That's a problem. Unlike a coal-fired or natural gas-fired plant, you can't keep it running. You can't keep them running necessarily all the time, the renewable plants. And secondly, there's the geography of wind and sunshine resources versus the geography of demand. A lot of solar plants and wind power plants are located in more remote parts of the country. So you have to transport electricity to where it's being demanded. So you need more high voltage power lines to deal with these problems. And Zero Life has actually estimated that if we only grow in the United States transmission line capacity at its current rate of 1%, we're going to lose 80% of the emissions reduction potential from the Inflation Reduction Act. To get the full potential, you need to grow transmission line capacity at about 2.3%. And there's a key public policy challenge here, which is that unlike interstate natural gas and oil pipelines, which are regulated by the federal government through something called the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, long distance transmission lines are regulated by individual states. And so that actually creates more veto points for groups to potentially block transmission line projects. So how do you deal with this? Well, one way that policymakers in Washington were thinking about dealing with this was through this Manchin permitting bill, the Joe Manchin permitting bill, which did a number of things. It first of all, it expedited something called the Mountain Valley Pipeline, a natural gas pipeline that goes through West Virginia. It places a 2-year limit on the time to conduct environmental impact assessments, and it places a time limit on court challenges under the National Environmental Policy Act. And it extends some federal government authority over high voltage, long distance power lines by giving the president the ability to designate up to 25 high priority energy infrastructure projects, about half of which would be fossil projects, about half of which would be transmission line projects. My view is that this was very imperfect. It probably does more good than harm, but it's a moot question at this point because it's dead. It was supposed to be attached to the continuing resolution that would have funded the federal, that was intended to fund the federal government for the next few months, but it got pulled. So this could come back. My hope is if a permitting bill comes back, it'll be a little bit better and put a little bit more emphasis on high voltage transmission lines. But something like this, I think, does have to happen. And with that, let me close and just say I think this is a big deal. benefits exceed costs. It helps build a really, I think, robust climate economy in the United States. It has some really neat, innovative policy features. But you can also hold the thought in your mind that it's a small step toward reducing global warming. Doesn't make that much impact on inflation. I think on inflation, it doesn't hurt things. Has a small impact on the budget deficit. I think a good one, it reduces the budget deficit. You can hold that thought and these other thoughts in your mind at the same time, I think. All right, Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. We are going to dive into some questions real quick and see how many we can get to. And if we don't get to everything, then, maybe we can get our heads together and find a way to answer some questions offline later. But for right now, let's dive in. We have gotten some questions about carbon tax. I know that this particular bill is able to replicate a lot of the incentives and benefits of a carbon tax without being a carbon tax. But do you think that there still is a role for a carbon tax to play either in the US or globally? Or do you think other countries are maybe taking a look and saying, hey, maybe we should go this route instead?
Well, other countries do. There are some other countries that do have carbon taxes, Norway and Sweden, for example, but not many. Most countries that price carbon, and there's something like 60 some countries around the world that put a price on carbon right now, do so through what is called a cap and trade system, similar to the system that existed in the EU that basically puts a cap on emissions in various sectors and allows firms to basically trade certificates that allow them to exceed their limits. So, I'll give you two answers. One is kind of the traditional textbook economist answer, and that answer is yes, there absolutely is a role for pricing carbon. The desirable thing about pricing carbon is it deals directly with the externality in a technology neutral way. And so it allows the market to respond by placing its own bets as opposed to having more top-down direction, which is what happens when you actually have subsidy-based incentives. And that's good. I think that's good. I don't see widespread adoption of carbon taxes either in the United States or around the world. And this is the second part of my answer. And that's because the distributional effects of carbon taxes are probably problematic for many. So if you look in the United States, for example, the amount of money that people spend on electricity doesn't actually increase that much as their income goes up. And so to the extent that a carbon tax that affects the electricity sector, for example, is passed through in the form of higher electricity prices, that will have a disproportionate impact on lower income households. Now, you might say, well, okay, you can deal with that by essentially using the carbon tax revenue to compensate people. But there's two problems with that. One is that that's actually not very popular. Even though economists like it and kind of big thinkers like it, it's just not very popular. An initiative like that actually failed in the state of Washington a few years back. And then secondly, it's actually very difficult to target the necessary rebates that you need to kind of keep people whole. If you really want to if you really want to prevent people from being worse off from a carbon tax, you have to have very, very fine-tuned targeting, which is probably impossible to do. So I think the future are more modest fee-based programs like the Methane Emissions Fee, coupled with more technology-neutral subsidies like the new technology-neutral production tax credit.
Now, if you wanted, you could stop sharing your slides at this point.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
I did want to ask you how protected this law is sort of politically from being revoked or annulled if there's a change in the political winds. I know this is something that the US has struggled with historically.
I think it's very well protected. That's an interesting question. I think it's very well protected. I think the provisions of this policy are broadly popular. Now, you might say, well, the methane emissions fee might not be particularly popular. But I think the provisions of this law are broadly popular, that it will be hard to actually reverse it. I could imagine that if there is at some point a Republican trifecta, that they might try to reduce funding for the IRS. But that couldn't happen until 2025 at the earliest, I think. And even that's, it's not clear how likely that is. That's not going to affect the climate provision parts. By the way, I do like the additional IRS enforcement. That's a whole other conversation. But I think the climate provisions are very safe.
All right, I think we'll have time for one really quick question, and then I think we got to stop. Just more broadly, do you see this as carefully written legislation, or do you think that there are buried in the details certain things that private sector actors will be able to exploit or circumvent?
Well, that's generically, the latter is generically the case when it comes to complex pieces of legislation. So I wouldn't be surprised. However, what I will say is that a lot of the ideas in this legislation have been floating around policy circles for a while now. For example, the idea for a greenhouse gas reduction fund, kind of for this national green bank, goes back to the mid 2010s. I mean, people have been talking about this for a while. So I think these ideas have been, reasonably well vetted, and I don't think there's going to be any super catastrophic negative unintended consequences, but there are unintended consequences, to be sure, and we will see them here and there, I think.
Well, thank you so much. We are unfortunately at time. I want to thank Professor David Besanko for this absolutely fabulous presentation. I learned a lot. Thank you for everyone who attended, for all the great questions we got in. Sorry we didn't have a chance to answer them. Maybe we can do more of that offline. And we're going to send the slides. You'll get a video of this talk early next week. And of course, please join us again to talk about ESG investing with Professor Erin Yoon on November 17th. That registration should be live on our site. If not now, then very soon. So thank you so much, and please take care.
Thank you.